Why do we make mistakes? Easy. Mistakes are the mechanism of learning and proof that learning is happening. Thank you and good night. In this episode of D-Talk, we are going to explore questions like, if mistakes are necessary for learning, why do so many people react to them with avoidance? Why do some people grow through mistakes while others seem to run around making the same ones over and over and over? And why do so many educational institutions seem determined to punish the very process that allows learning to occur? Mistakes are a biological process that's connected to neuroscience. They are also social events. You see it everywhere. You know exactly what I'm talking about, but let me give you an example. You're at the zoo, okay? Stay with me. You're at the zoo in the penguin exhibit, and the penguin handler grabs the distorted microphone and yells into it, "Does anybody know how many fish an average penguin eats in one day?" And let's say there's 100 people in the room.
100 people can be in a room.
Half of the room is jumping and exclaiming numbers from 2 to 10,000. Do you think that half is the children? Or that half is the adults? And then it raises the question, why do children behave like that? And what the hell happened to us in the process of becoming people who avoided answering questions because they're afraid to look stupid? The environments that produce the most innovation, so scientific labs, artistic communities, startup cultures, all of these things share one common feature. They generate lots of mistakes. The difference is those mistakes are treated as data. A failed experiment in a chemistry lab is not a moral failing. It's information about how a system behaves. Iteration in these fields is normal because failure is simply a routine. It's where strange results need to be investigated instead of swept under the rug. We need mistakes to signal possibility rather than humiliation. Fundamentally, this means changing how we talk about failure itself. Because when the brain recognizes that something is wrong, it's also the same moment that the brain becomes capable of becoming right in a brand new way. If you only remember one thing from this episode, it should be this. Failure is one of learning's primary tools. Which raises the important question, if error feels like a social threat and threat narrows cognition and narrowed cognition reduces exploration, then how do we ever learn anything? And in this episode, we're going to attempt to unpack some of that tension. Ultimately, mistakes are not moral failures. They are model failures. And the anterior cingulate cortex, my favorite, dramatic, vigilant, and exquisitely sensitive conflict monitor, is not trying to humiliate us. It's trying to protect us. The question is whether our environments interpret that signal as danger or as growth. Because just like the feeling of anxiousness and excitement, our brains cannot recognize the difference unless we train them to do so. That was good. Okay, let's get into it. Detox starts now.
That's it.
Now it's time for Silly Stories with David, the part of the podcast where David shares some silly mistakes. So a nice topical one for the beginning. I once taught a math lesson about prime numbers and composite numbers completely backwards, completely inverted, which means that there was a room full of students somewhere who for at least 24 hours believed that 7 was composite because of me. To be fair, only if they were listening, which most weren't. The moment I realized what I had done, I didn't think, oh, that's incorrect. Let me just fix that tomorrow. My brain started replaying that scene on loop. My reaction wasn't about mathematics. My reaction was about character and efficacy. Because within milliseconds of making a mistake, the brain generates what researchers call the error-related negativity, or ERN. It's an electrical signal measured by an EEG that originates largely in my favorite diva, the anterior cingulate cortex. The ERN shows up before we even consciously register an error, which is so fascinating to me because our brains know that we've made a mistake before we know we've made a mistake. The anterior cingulate cortex is most simply explained as the model integrity supervisor, and it also activates when we experience social rejection or relational conflict, meaning that being wrong and being excluded share the same neural real estate. This is a result of human evolution because historically, mistakes in social environments had potential life-threatening consequences. Misjudge a threat, misread a group, the cost was potential survival. When I had realized that I had inverted prime and composite numbers, my nervous system was not evaluating mathematics. To this day, I still do not know the difference between prime and composite numbers, or rather which one is which. I didn't learn that after making that mistake. I was evaluating my status as a teacher, which is something completely unrelated. Okay, here's a different kind of mistake. I once dropped a full can of wood stain on the floor of Home Depot, and it exploded. That's the important part. All over the concrete flooring, the surrounding shelving units, and me. I had to go home and throw my entire outfit, including my shoes, straight in the trash. The moment I dropped the can, a few things happened. My stomach dropped, my body heat rose, I had tunnel vision, it was full body panic. And it was not the same reaction I had to the inverted math lesson, but it was similar enough to reveal to me that the same circuitry had been activated in my brain, social exposure. It was the customers that were in the aisles at the time that heard it and then came running to see the red stain everywhere. It was red. Did I say that? It looked like blood stains. The embarrassment I felt was more about the social nature of that mistake. If you're ever in the Lethbridge Home Depot and you want to walk down the paint aisle, look for the red stains on the concrete and tell them David sent you. Jesus. I have one final mistake, and this one is not subtle and it's not funny. A few years after the stain incident, I was about 25. I left my stable job, I sold my house, and for the first time in my adult life, I moved cities. And at the time, it felt catastrophic. My brain treated it like an irreversible failure, and there were nights where my rumination was so relentless, where I was replaying decisions, forecasting regret, scanning for information that I had just ruined literally everything in my life. And the twist in this perceived mistake is that now I don't see that as a mistake at all, which shows me something very critical. The brain's error detection system, it's not always right. The anterior cingulate cortex, while powerful, she is simply a mismatch detector. It lights up when expectations collide with outcomes. It just signals update required, but it doesn't know whether the update represents growth or a catastrophe. That interpretation comes later down the line in processing. So, confusion, embarrassment, regret, all of these feelings begin as prediction errors, and prediction errors are the raw materials of learning. And I want to go one step further here and say that dopamine neurons in the midbrain fire in response to discrepancies between expected and actual outcomes. So, when outcomes are worse than expected, dopamine dips. But when outcomes are better than expected, dopamine spikes. And these fluctuations drive enforcement learning, which is the mechanism by which the brain updates models of the world. If there is no error signal, there is no update. And if there is no update, there is no learning. The same neural systems that makes being wrong feel awful is the same system that makes learning possible. Here's the thing that middle schoolers understand intuitively. Being wrong is dangerous. Not always physically, but socially. Our brains don't really have the power to distinguish between social pain and physical pain, so when people experience social rejection, regions like the anterior insula activate in ways that overlap with physical pain processing. And the same conflict detection areas light up when you feel excluded from a group. So when somebody hesitates to answer a question, what's happening behind the scenes is a very complex risk assessment. Their brain is running a cost-benefit analysis that goes something like this. Correct answer, small reward. Incorrect answer, possible embarrassment, status loss, laughter, eye rolls. That second outcome weighs a lot more heavily. And then you add in rejection sensitivity. So rejection sensitivity is the tendency to anxiously expect, readily perceive, or overreact to rejection. The citation is the year I was born. How appropriate is that? People high in rejection sensitivity will often interpret ambiguous situations as threatening. So a neutral facial expression becomes disapproval. Silence becomes criticism. And here's where it connects to mistakes. If being wrong feels like rejection, and rejection feels like a threat, then mistake making becomes a gamble of your own survival. The anterior cingulate cortex detects a conflict, like I might be wrong if I answer this question. The amygdala evaluates the threat. This could cost me socially, and the body responds accordingly by activating your parasympathetic nervous system. Cortisol rises, heart rate shifts, and if we feel threatened, cognition narrows because it's one of our brain's evolutionary jobs. When the lion is chasing you, you don't brainstorm alternative strategies. Girl, you run. The problem is that in the 21st century, learning requires cognitive flexibility. It requires play, testing hypotheses, and tolerating incorrect prediction. So if mistakes feel unsafe, exploration shuts down. Here's where I get frustrated, both as an educator and a human in the world, because I often wonder why folks just don't have the active understanding that you can do and achieve whatever you want as long as you have the time and patience to do so. The answer to that question is that the premise collides with neurobiology, because understanding that sentiment is not the same as feeling safe enough to embody it. And I know there's a lot of outliers to that statement, but if you're listening to this right now and your immediate reaction is to go, oh, well, not me, I couldn't because I could never. That's rejection sensitivity that is built in before you even considered what I said. And a lot of people don't feel safe to make mistakes. I'm passionate about this specifically because I used to disagree with myself because I was very sensitive to rejection. Anyhow, Carol Dweck is a researcher that popularized the idea of growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And the fixed mindset shows that when people believe that their ability is fixed, mistakes will often threaten their identity. See the episode on identity. Alternatively, in a growth framework, the same error becomes information about strategy. The challenge is to switch from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And this requires exposure to non-catastrophic failure consistently. It does take an incredible amount of practice to be okay with mistakes because it requires retraining of your nervous system. So not everyone experiences errors at the same volume. The real skill to build up here is to separate exploration from paralysis, and that, my dear friends, is called distress tolerance. Distress tolerance is the ability to experience uncomfortable internal states without fleeting them. Psychologically, this has been studied in relation to anxiety and avoidance behaviors. The more intolerable an emotion feels, the more likely a person is to avoid situations that trigger it. And avoidance does work in the short term. You don't answer the question, you don't raise your hand, you don't apply for the dream job, and anxiety drops when avoidance is successful, and the brain learns avoidance equals relief. That's negative reinforcement, which is a powerful learning mechanism, but not in the ways that we want. The removal of discomfort strengthens the behavior that removed it, but that becomes a brutal trade-off, because you cannot succeed at anything complex if you cannot tolerate being bad at it first. Every skill acquisition curve begins with incompetence. I'm going to say that again. Every skill acquisition curve begins with incompetence. You're gonna be awful. I encourage you, please go to episode 1, season 1 of D-Talk with David They. That's me. The episode looked, sounded nothing like this. I wasn't necessarily incompetent, but
I have lists of TikToks in my phones that I'm not opening.
no, I was incompetent. Let's go ahead and say that. Anyway, the brain has to generate these error signals to update motor plans, cognitive strategies, or social scripts. Dopamine-based reinforcement learning depends on this prediction error. If there is no error, there is no update. And if making mistakes is unbearable, the brain chooses safety over growth every single time. And because it provides you with psychological safety, this feels rational and then is reinforced. This is why it takes practice. This is why we shouldn't be teaching people to just be confident. What? You can't just say those words when you're trying to teach somebody's nervous system that error does not equal exile. That is a much deeper intervention than a single be confident or you got this. Shoot for the moon and if you miss you'll land amongst the no, sorry. Mistakes are inevitable. They're gonna happen. The real question is whether our nervous system interprets that as data or as danger, because that interpretation determines the size of your world. In the next chapter, we're going to dig into why avoidance feels smarter than trying and how the brain's bias toward loss prevention quickly sabotages our long-term growth goals while convincing us that it is protecting us. So in this chapter, I'm going to walk us through, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there's a lot. I'm just going to talk us through a lot of different theories because there's a lot of different competing things going on in our brain from a lot of different areas of study. So I've compiled a list here of a bunch of different theories. It's going to be pretty information heavy, but just stay with me and then in the conclusion, we'll wrap it all up together in one little bow. Okay? The uncomfortable truth that we unpacked in the last chapter is that avoidance works. If somebody doesn't raise their hand, their anxiety drops. If you don't send a risky email, your stomach settles. If you don't attempt the thing you might fail at, you don't have to feel the sting of being wrong. And that relief is immediate, and the brain loves immediacy. In operant conditioning, negative reinforcement means a behavior increases because it removes an unpleasant state. So avoidance removes anxiety, and that relief strengthens avoidance. Anxiety researchers have shown repeatedly that avoidance maintains fear because it prevents this corrective learning. Exposure-based treatments work precisely because they block avoidance and allow the brain to update its threat predictions. Because if you never test a scenario that you fear, the brain never gathers disconfirming data in order to update the model. So essentially, operant conditioning shows us that avoidance preserves the illusion of threat. Another theory here is prospect theory, and that demonstrates that humans weigh losses more heavily than gains. So in practice, if somebody is picturing a potential gain, they might get praise, pride. But the potential loss is embarrassment and maybe their status drops. So the emotional weight of a loss is much heavier than the emotional weight of a potential gain. And neuroimaging studies support this because it shows that anticipated losses activate the amygdala and the insula more strongly than the equivalent gains activate reward regions. So when somebody hesitates and gets embarrassed and avoids answering something, it's not about being dramatic or defiant. It's their brains overweighing the downside. Then we have the behavioral inhibition system. So Jeffrey Gray's reinforcement sensitivity theory describes the behavioral inhibition system as activated by signals of punishment, novelty, or uncertainty. So when the behavioral inhibition system, or BIS for short, activates, behavior slows or stops. And classrooms are very rich in uncertainty and novelty and evaluation and punishment too, unfortunately. So avoidance in this way is often a behavioral inhibition system dominating over everything else. Another thing here is self-worth theory, and that suggests that students sometimes reduce effort to protect identity. So if failure is interpreted as low ability, then trying becomes dangerous. So not trying preserves potential. Avoidance can function in this way as identity armor because I didn't try is psychologically safer than I tried, but it wasn't enough. So avoidance in this way emerges from fear, but also expectation. So if the brain predicts failure, why would the brain put in energy? It's just metabolically nonsensical. So evolution optimized us for immediate survival, not long-term skill acquisition. So avoiding things lowers our physiological arousal, it protects our social standing, it prevents loud error signals, and it preserves our self-concept. But trying things risks embarrassment, activates error monitoring, and increases short-term anxiety, and we don't want any of that. So given that cost-benefit analysis, avoidance is rational, but only in the short term. That's the whole point here, is that it makes sense metabolically only in the short term. And there's another layer here as well as it relates to queer theory, because a lot of queer people, this is completely anecdotal, but I'm just going to say it because I feel it. A lot of queer people don't envision their lives beyond the age of 18. I just simply couldn't conceptualize myself being an adult. And while I thought this was an individual experience, as I move about the world and talk with other people, I realize it is nearly universal. And this is especially detrimental to brains who are only able to think in the short term. As soon as I started seeing my future beyond the age of 18, I was able to stop thinking in the short term because more than the short term existed. Anyway, to end this chapter, you cannot build competence without tolerating incompetence. And you can't update a model that you never test. And understanding that shifts the narrative from why won't they try to how unsafe does trying feel? Next up, we're going to move to the pivot point. What happens when failure is structured to be safe? Because when nervous systems learn that mistakes do not equal social death, our appetite for risk changes. Our nervous systems do not care about our intention. It only responds to signals of threat, salience, and safety. If feedback feels like judgment, it triggers the amygdala and the anterior cingulate cortex, shuts down exploration, right? We've been through that. And because of this, error becomes trauma and not data. But if feedback signals safety, it does the exact opposite. The anterior cingulate cortex flags the misstep and the brain just says, hey, prediction violated. That's fun. But the entire difference here is that the context behind the mistake is what matters, because the nervous system does not go into survival mode, it goes into hypothesis mode. And this is exactly what we want. That's the bread and butter. No, that's the that's the lifeblood of learning, because dopamine spikes, the prefrontal cortex lights up and working memory engages. You get your hippocampus involved and neuroplasticity thrives. It's exactly what we want. Think about any mistake that you've made in your entire life. When we reflect on those mistakes, which are the ones that actually taught us something? The ones that we survived. And here's the thing to remember, the same mechanism that works for students, colleagues, friends, and even you watching this video right now, if mistakes are punished or shame-laden, our appetite for risk shrinks. And we stop experimenting, we stop learning, we stop creating things. But if mistakes are framed as exploration, iteration, and controlled, the brain learns something radical. Failure is not annihilation, failure is information. And failure is the door to recalibration. Failure is not annihilation, failure is information. And failure is the door to recalibration.
I'm a straight up rapstress.
So safe failure plus clear, supportive feedback rewires our nervous systems. It increases resilience, improves learning, and yes, makes our lives feel more expansive. Our anterior cingulate cortexes still light up at the errors. It still tells us, oops, that's off, but it stops screaming, danger, danger, stop everything, the sky is falling, Chicken Little, etc. You understand. And it just starts whispering, hey, adjust that. Try that again. And let's be real. The real world rarely rewards perfection, okay? It just rewards persistence in most cases. It rewards courage, curiosity, mess, experimentation. The anterior cingulate cortex wants to judge us at all times, yes, but if you give it the context and the safety that it needs, it becomes your co-pilot instead of your jailer. Some of the most interesting thinking around mistakes in the past 20 years hasn't come from neuroscience or sociology, it's actually come from queer theory. In 2011, queer theorist Jack Halberstam published a book called The Queer Art of Failure. And their argument in this book is deceptively simple, but also incredibly powerful. Modern society is obsessed with success. Success defined through rigid metrics like productivity, wealth, status, normalcy, achievement. Those definitions of success also create very narrow pathways through life. If you deviate from them, you are most often labeled a failure. Queer communities historically have been excluded from those very pathways, and they often had no choice but to build lives outside those definitions of success. And in doing so, they developed something remarkable, an entire cultural toolkit for navigating failure, and Halberstam calls this the queer art of failure. So when you look at it this way, failure stops being a dead end and starts becoming the method. And this idea connects beautifully with another queer theory called queer mess. Queer mess rejects the idea that progress must be clean, linear, and predictable. Instead, it recognizes that learning, identity, and social change are often chaotic. Things get weird, contradictions pile up, experiments go sideways, but out of all of that mess, new structures emerge. And in many ways, this definition fits learning remarkably well. Real learning is almost never neat. It's messy. You misunderstand concepts. You try strategies that don't work. You revise. You backtrack. You stumble into insights that you had never thought you had, Our brains are an evolving ecosystem of hypotheses constantly competing for survival. And mistakes are the mutations of those hypotheses. So here's the challenge in classrooms. Make environments where errors are seen, they are named, and they are iterated on. Give your students, your friends, your colleagues, yourself, the radical gift of safety in the face of failure. Normalize the mess, normalize the weirdness, the things that just come out of it. Don't be so hard on yourself. Oh, I feel like I end up saying that every episode. Stop being so hard on yourself. Be the little weirdo. Do all the things. Who cares? Oh.
This is what trauma looks like.
At the end of the day, the art of the mess is not just a teaching strategy, it's a philosophy of life. Mess, iterate, grow, learn, repeat. And that, my friends, is how you teach brains that were built for exploration, curiosity, and yes, failure. Glorious, spectacular, human failure. Thanks for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. You can listen to these episodes on Spotify, watch them on YouTube, and follow the short form content on Instagram and TikTok at DTalk with David Dave, because that's me. Thanks for watching this episode, and I will see you in the next one. And until then, goodbye. Some brains scream a lot louder when mistakes happen. Hi, it's me. Nice to meet you.